Jim Telemonte.
In Round Lake Beach, Cedar Lake Road at Rollins Road. Avoid the area if you can. There's a crash with injuries there. There's also a collision in Volo on 12 at Mulador Road. I-80 eastbound traffic is bottled up from Larkin to Center Street with pothole repair work blocking the right lane. Westbound at Manuka Road, a crash involving two semis has just the right shoulder blocked. In Von Eisenhower, traffic's tight Ashland to the Bird Circle. 29 minutes, 390 to downtown. Even Stevenson, traffic's a little bit heavy. Ashland to the Ryan. I-55 has roadwork delays both ways between River Road and Blodgett. And there is, on the South Shore line, the announcement that now the May passes purchased are also good for June. That's traffic. I'm Jim Telemonte on AM 560, The Answer.
Chicago's Morning Answer continues next in our 1 hour heating and air conditioning weather center. Cloudy, breezy, maybe an afternoon shower or thunderstorm this afternoon, high 64. Currently, 50 degrees. Next news coming up at 8:30. And Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy continues next on AM 560, The Answer.
Listen to AM 560, The Answer, online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, on TuneIn, iHeart, and radio.com. This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy, and going back to Doctors Erickson and Masihi, these two Bakersfield, California docs who have...
They've been on the front line. They're ER doctors, microbiologists. They've done it all.
Their press conference that they had, their press avail, that has gone viral with more than 4 million views at this point, going through chapter and verse on the models, the comparison to the flu, country-to-country comparison, lockdown versus no lockdown, immunology 101. It was pretty comprehensive, not that there's not some disagreement because local health officials in the county in which they operate disagree with some of the conclusions that they've drawn. But here's what Dr. Dan Erickson had to say about, number one, quarantining.
Even though everything we've studied about quarantine, typically you quarantine the sick. When someone has measles, you quarantine them. We've never seen where we quarantine the healthy, where you take those without disease and without symptoms and lock them in your home. So some of these things, from what we've studied from immunology and microbiology, aren't really meshing with what we know as people of scientific minds that read this stuff every day.
And then using the model they know best because they've been involved in some of the antibody testing in their community, California.
What is materializing in the state of California is 12% positives. Well, if we have 39.5 million people. If we just take a basic calculation and extrapolate that out, that equates to about 4.7 million cases throughout the state of California, which means this thing is widespread. That's the good news. We've seen 1,227 deaths in the state of California with a possible incidence or prevalence of 4.7 million. That means you have a 0.03 chance of dying from COVID-19 in the state of California. 0.03 chance of dying from COVID in the state of California. Does that necessitate sheltering in place? Does that necessitate shutting down medical systems? Does that necessitate people being out of work?
And just looking at data where the country has been hardest hit, New York City.
Right, they're the epicenter.
Of the 10,981 deaths, the percentage of those who died with no underlying condition is 0.005.
Wow.
The deaths under the age of 44 with no underlying condition, 0.0008. 73% of all deaths are over the age of 65. 51% of all deaths over the age of 65 with at least one comorbidity. So I know it's been stated, but it doesn't seem to be received in wide swaths of the population that this virus, yes, anybody can get it. But the idea of saying anybody can get it without the context of incidence and lethality is irresponsible. I mean, it's just irresponsible. How do you look at those numbers? There are 0 deaths in New York City, 0 to 17 with no underlying condition. 0.
0, right.
So how do you say a 0 to 17-year-old can get it just like a 75-year-old can get it and then pretend those things are the same? They're not. And people are going to say, well, no, they're saying it's the elderly and those with underlying conditions we need to protect. That's not how it's being received based on the behavior we see from, millennials on up the age cohort. For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by a medical professional. He is Dr. David Beuther. He's a pulmonologist at National Jewish Health. Doctor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, there's so much flying around, as you well know. You're in the thick of it too, in terms of information and trying to make sense of it, particularly for laymen like me. And so, how do you present what the challenges that faces us at present?
Well, I think we have to take a big dose of kind of humble pie here, that we really don't know as much as we would like to know about this disease. So a condition like influenza, it may change from year to year, but we just know a heck of a lot about the biology of the disease and the transmission. And one of the challenges here is we have the blindfolds on still. You're just presenting some data, but really we don't know how infectious this is. We're getting a better sense of how dangerous it is. And I think what's scary is that, in our ICUs around the country, we're seeing normal people like you and me dying of COVID-19. This business of chronic condition, we all want to have a fantasy that that's not us. It's somebody else. It's the other person. But the reality is half of us are overweight or obese. That's a condition. High blood pressure, diabetes. And so most people have some chronic condition. So when we talk about chronic conditions putting you at risk, that's more than half of us.
And the best way to know how many people have it is to test people, and especially people who think that they might have had it in the antibody test. And what are you guys offering?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the challenges, is that we haven't had testing, and we still really don't have the testing we need. And the standard for whether or not you're infectious is a molecular test, where we stick a Q-tip-like device in the back of your nose. It's called a nasopharyngeal swab, and it measures for pieces or particles of the virus. It's very sensitive, and if that test is positive, it strongly suggests that you have an active infection and that you should be isolating and you could get others infected. But the problem is that there really are very few tests, and at our center we have a pretty high throughput test. We can do 1,200, 1,400 a day, but we're limited by the number of these swabs. I mean, literally the test kits are the limiting factor, and as soon as you get enough of those, there's some other limiting factor. And so one of the things that we've done recently is expand the type of testing to this serology that we're talking about today. And there are very many different ways to do this. We're very concerned about putting out just the best quality tests. And so what we have, the blood test, it's called an ELISA, so we can run a large volume of these tests and test a lot of people. But it's important to note that serology, what it is it's measuring your immune system's response to the virus. So it's not here to tell you whether or not you're suddenly infectious. It's more telling you what happened in the past. It's telling you whether your immune system responded to COVID-19. And so it's giving you different information, telling you more what's the prevalence of the disease, how many people have been exposed or infected, not necessarily are you sick right now.
I want to talk more about the serology, but I just want to go back for a second on what you said about the data and having an underlying condition can be obese, and so it's a lot more than people would like to think. Still, in New York City, all deaths under the age of 44 represent underlying condition, no underlying condition, represent 3.5% of the deaths. So, I mean, I just want to make sure that I understand what you're saying, and are you're not saying that 65 and over, 75 and over is the same as 45 and under?
No, absolutely not. But coming from a critical care doctor and speaking from the inside of the healthcare system, we don't hear from them very much in the media. And these ICUs were overwhelmed in New York. We have doctors in New York that are on the front lines, and we have doctors here in Denver in the ICUs. And we were a little better off here in Denver than they were in New York. But still, we had got really quite close to running out of key equipment and personnel. and ability to care. So if you think about this kind of like a pyramid, where the sickest people that are hospitalized are at the top of the pyramid, and the very tip of that pyramid or iceberg are the people in the ICU and the people at high risk of death. Even if we have a ton of people that get infected with mild cases, that tip of the pyramid is what can overwhelm the healthcare system. And, if you overwhelm the healthcare system, what you have is people, toughing out their heart attack at home and dying because they're afraid to come in or not being able to take care of the routine sort of medical conditions that we have. And so this entire system has been really all about not overwhelming the healthcare system, which is quite fragile and quite overwhelmed in a normal day. You add the pandemic to it, and all of a sudden we can't take care of people. So, even if it's a small number, the issue is how do we maintain a functioning healthcare system through this pandemic?
Yeah,
so we need to keep that.
I'm sorry
to keep that rate of really sick people at a fairly modest amount over the next 18 months.
Well, right, and to your point about the people who have other conditions that need treatment not coming, prospectively, that appears to be happening. Cleveland Clinic cardiologist Dr. Steve Nissen, where are the patients? This can't be normal. After only 7 patients in the 24-bed coronary care unit came to the Cleveland Clinic on a recent day. The unit is usually full. This is a Yahoo News story. Amid the coronavirus crisis, heart and stroke patients go missing because they have been arguably frightened into not getting the treatment they need. And now you're having a system where, because it's been so COVID focused, the reports all over the country are layoffs, furloughs, salary cuts. So now you're seeing the healthcare infrastructure that you talk about as precarious being undermined just as we're starting to reopen, and you could have the worst of all possible worlds because of the shutdown.
Well, I don't think that's the way I would approach it. I think the issue is that the stay-at-home orders are really kind of an indication of a failure to control the system. This is the bluntest tool we have, and what we're supposed to be doing during this month or two is gearing up our healthcare system, our public health surveillance and tracking system, and our testing. And so kind of the craziness is we may or may not have overreacted to this, but when we open back up, we still have the blinders on. We're still looking 3 miles behind us, and we're hitting the gas on the freeway going 60 miles an hour, not looking 3 miles behind us because we don't have testing. And so I think we still worry. It's a balance, right?
Yeah.
As we start to open up, we need to have the ability to take care of that heart attack patient, that kidney stone, but we also, it's very close to being able to overwhelm all of our critical care capacity with COVID-19. I mean, it's just a tremendous tidal wave that could overwhelm the healthcare system, and we don't want that either.
Have you reached your peak in Denver? I mean, are things on the downslide of the curve?
We have. I mean, this gets to the testing issue. Our hospitalizations are starting to slow down. Our ICU admissions and deaths have backed off from their peak. Yet the number of cases detected are going up, and I think that reflects just what you were talking about earlier, that because we haven't had the testing, we really don't know how many people have been ill. And if we find out that 2 or 3 times as many people as we thought were ill with COVID-19, then yes, the actual mortality from this will be lower than what we thought, because maybe there were many, many mild cases we just didn't know about. But we really don't know that yet.
Right. But although we have some early indications, and I know this is all these studies coming out are still subject to peer review, and so all the caveats. But Santa Clara, the LA County USC study, the numbers out of New York at the end of last week. I was talking to Andrew Bogan, who's a microbiologist, and he was one of the co-authors of the Santa Clara study, which the methodology has been criticized. And he's like, well, fine, that's why we have peer review. Go ahead and criticize it. But with respect to one of the things he said, and I want to get your reaction to this too, is about herd immunity. It's like, so when you say it could be 2 to 4% of population in a particular region that may have been infected, so 50 to 85 times the number of reported cases, well, that's still only 2 to 4% of the population. And so I asked him, but that still says there's a whole, overwhelming majority of the population that still has exposure risk. And his response was, that's true, but you have to understand, herd immunity, there's no magic percentage to herd immunity. And so so we don't actually have a hard number like you have to get to 25%, you have to get to 35%, 45% who've had the virus to get to herd immunity. Is that your understanding as well? And if it is, then how do we know when we're getting close to that place that that place of a relative safety, I guess, is the best way I can describe it.
Yeah, I agree, and it's really unclear. People have thrown around 60% of people having to be exposed, and we don't know if that's true, and it depends on each individual virus and the dynamics involved. So I imagine as we open up communities and businesses and we start to see that in the absence of a vaccine, that a positive case does not lead to as much of an outbreak as we would otherwise expect, we would start to believe herd immunity. But that's where this serologic testing can be really, really helpful. So if a business wants to come and open up, it depends on the question you want to answer. If they want to answer, is this employee infected, we'd want to do that molecular PCR test with a nasal swab. But the serology will tell you more, how many of your employees are infected, and maybe what it could tell you is in a certain area, like the cafeteria. Cafeteria workers have a higher prevalence of, serologic positivity. I'm just making that up. But if you found that, well, then you need to put more measures in that area. One of the things that we're seeing is just an overwhelming demand for our blood tests to see whether or not somebody's been infected in the past from the community. And I think what's happened is people have been so scared and so panicked, and they've also made up a fantasy that little mild sniffles that they had back in February or March must have been a mild case of COVID-19, and now they're immune.
Right.
What they're finding out is that the serology ends up often being negative, which is a pretty good sign they have not been exposed or infected. And we're kind of bursting their bubble a little bit, but that might be good. It might be good for people not to assume, that we've all been infected, because actually a fairly small number of people have been infected with COVID-19 at this point. We're all still very susceptible.
Right. But what do we know? If you've been infected, are you immune then, or are you immune for a certain amount of time? Or do we
Well,
just
we don't
not
know that at all. We don't know that at all either. There's certainly little evidence to suggest that these antibodies are neutralizing or protective. We would like to believe, and we do believe intuitively, that if you develop an antibody response to this thing, that you're a little less likely to get infected the next time, or maybe less likely to get severely ill. And so you should feel good about that, but you also shouldn't feel that you're immune, because we just have little evidence to suggest that. And in fact, in South Korea, there's some evidence that people have gotten infected again, or at least they've expressed, they've been shedding virus again. And there are ongoing studies to really try to answer that. I think we're going to know a lot more about this in a few months.
Just sort of generally speaking, two questions. One, is it true what the Bakersfield, California emergency doc said? That, we don't quarantine healthy people, we quarantine sick people, number one. And number two, that as a virus mutates, so COVID-19 mutates other strains, that it usually becomes weaker, even if we have to battle COVID-19 and its mutations year after year.
Yeah, so coronaviruses are, I'm not a microbiologist, but coronaviruses typically do not mutate as often or as dramatically as, say, the seasonal influenza, where we're always kind of chasing the southern hemisphere's latest strain with a different vaccine and hope it matches, because year to year it changes. Certainly coronavirus can mutate and change a bit, but it doesn't appear to change as much as influenza. And so I think we have to assume most of us are susceptible. If we don't get a vaccine, that we're going to be dealing with coronavirus for the next 18 to 24 months at least. But eventually the selection pressure is to kill fewer people, to be a little bit more mild over time. But hopefully we'll have a vaccine before we get to that point. And
quarantining the healthy in addition to the sick?
Well, it's all we have. We really, we knew about this coming. We weren't able to. I mean, it's just no country has been able to respond in time, and so the bluntest tool we have is isolation, and it worked. We avoided tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of deaths, but it's time to try to find that balance, and that's really, nobody knows the answer to this. How much do you open your society? How many more cases will that cause? Will you be able to balance that carefully so we don't have yet another kind of breakout? And I think the most dangerous thing is if we open up too much too quickly, particularly early on in this time, there's a huge risk that we'll have to shut everything down all over again, and that would be just devastating to our economy. The best thing for our economy is to get control of the virus.
He is Dr. David Beuther, pulmonologist at National Jewish Health. Dr. Beuther, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
You've made the switch, and it feels so good. You've switched to Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560.